14 days after my sister publicly claimed my husband, she was standing on my front porch, shivering in the cold autumn rain. The doorbell had rung at 11 at night, a sharp, grating sound that cut through the silence of my living room. I opened the heavy oak door and found her clutching a thin jacket. The smell of damp wool and wet leaves clung to the fabric, while her cell phone buzzed relentlessly in her bare hands. It was a rapid, aggressive vibration, rattling against her rings like a trapped hornet. Paige looked up at me with swollen, red eyes. "He lied," she gasped, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the doorframe. "He owns nothing. The debt collectors will not stop calling. Someone just towed the SUV right out of the apartment parking lot." I stood perfectly still in the entryway of the house I had bought 3 years before I ever married Grant. At 38, as the sole founder and owner of Northline Design Group, my days were spent managing complex real estate staging and demanding clients. My name, Dana Mercer, usually meant order and control. But tonight, it just meant I was the woman looking at her cheating husband's mistress, who also happened to be her younger sibling. Tilting my head, I watched another collection agency flash across her cracked screen. Underneath the phone number, a caller ID displayed a corporate recovery agency. "So," I asked, letting the cold air settle between us, "are you enjoying everything he owns?" Paige let out a raw sob and tried to push past me into the warmth of the hallway. I shifted my weight, blocking her path entirely. "Dana, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "You have to help me." "I am going to give you 3 rules," I told her, keeping my tone completely flat. "You will turn off the auto-delete function on your text messages. You will not call Grant, and you will not sign a single piece of paper without showing it to me first." My sister stopped crying for a fraction of a second, blinking in confusion. "Did you know?" I did not answer her right away. To understand why I stood there without a single tear in my eyes, we have to go back exactly 2 weeks. The dining room at my mother's house always smelled heavily of rosemary chicken and lemon polish. It was the 12th of October, a Sunday family dinner, and my husband had arrived 40 minutes late. Grant walked in with Paige trailing closely behind him. He did not apologize for the delay. Instead, he tossed the silver key to his company vehicle onto the dining table, letting the metal clatter sharply against the fine china. It was a brand new luxury SUV, leased entirely by my company, but he wore it like a badge of his own success. He slid into the chair beside me, bringing a faint scent of expensive cologne and alcohol. I noticed the smudge of pink lipstick on the rim of his water glass before anyone even spoke, the exact same shade my sister had been wearing since August. Paige did not sit in her usual spot across from me. She walked over, pressed a kiss to Grant's cheek, and rested her hand flat against his chest. "He is mine now," Paige announced to the room. Grant stared intently at a spot on the tablecloth, entirely unable to meet my eyes. The silver key sat between us, catching the chandelier light. My mother, Barbara, set her wineglass down with a heavy thud. She looked at me, her mouth pressed into a thin, tight line. Her eyes held that familiar warning, the one that meant I needed to absorb the damage so the family could maintain its perfect picture. "Dana, do not make a scene," Mom snapped, leaning forward. "Just let them be. Do not ruin their happiness." I looked at the woman who had raised me, then at the man I had married, and finally at the sister who had always resented my independence. Grant was the vice president of business development at Northline. He possessed charm, a fantastic sales pitch, and absolutely zero equity in the business. "Do you have anything you want to share about the company while we are all gathered here?" I asked Grant, keeping my hands folded neatly in my lap. He shifted his weight, pulling at his collar, as if the room had suddenly grown too warm. "This is not about business, Dana. This is just about our marriage." It ran its course. He wanted to separate the betrayal from the bank accounts, cleanly severing his personal choices from his professional status. I smiled, slowly standing up from my chair. "Then enjoy everything he owns," I told her. I did not scream, and I did not reach for the silver car key. Gathering my purse, I walked out the front door, leaving the 3 of them sitting in stunned silence. By the time I reached the driveway, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was not a text from my mother demanding I come back inside to fix the mess. It was an automated security alert from the Northline server. The screen displayed an after-hours login warning. Someone had just accessed the restricted folder containing our quarterly financial projections. The user account belonged to Grant. He was sitting at my mother's dining table, playing the role of a man blinded by new love, but his laptop was active somewhere else, pulling data he had no authority to view. Sliding into the driver's seat, I locked the doors and dialed my chief financial officer. Lena answered on the second ring, her background noisy with television chatter. "Lena, I need you to conference in Maya right now," I said, starting the engine. "It is Sunday night," Lena protested, though I could hear the rapid clicking of a keyboard as she merged the call with our corporate attorney. Maya's calm voice clicked onto the line a moment later. "Dana, what is going on?" "Grant just publicly announced he is leaving me for Paige," I stated, steering the car out of the neighborhood. "But more importantly, his account is currently downloading financial projections from the main server." Silence stretched over the speakerphone for exactly 3 seconds. Maya was calculating the liability, while Lena was likely pulling up the server dashboard. "Put a complete legal hold on all his accounts," I instructed, merging onto the highway. "Do not delete anything. Do not change his passwords yet. Freeze the evidence, not the business. Call Noah and get him to run a full access log for the past 60 days. The drive home took 20 minutes. The hum of the tires against the asphalt grounded me while Lena and Maya worked in the background. A dull ache sat somewhere deep in my chest, a heavy reminder of a broken marriage, but the instinct to protect my life's work easily overpowered the sting of betrayal. My phone chimed through the car speakers. Noah, our external systems administrator, had joined the conference bridge. His voice sounded tight, lacking its usual casual rhythm, and he did not bother saying hello. "Dana," Noah said, pausing to take a sharp breath. He did not just open the financial files, he exported the investor package. For several seconds, no one on the conference line spoke. I kept both hands on the steering wheel and watched the highway lights streak across the windshield. My husband had just announced that he was leaving me for my sister. That should have been the only betrayal I was capable of processing. Instead, I was calculating exposure. "What exactly did he take?" I asked. Noah's keyboard clicked rapidly through the car speakers. "The current investor presentation, the quarterly projections, 2 archived due diligence folders, and a blank ownership certification template." A blank ownership certification template. The phrase lodged in my mind with more force than the sight of Paige kissing my husband's cheek. "Did he send anything outside the company?" Maya asked. "I cannot confirm that yet," Noah replied. "The export completed through his authorized Northline account. I can preserve the session logs and identify the destination only if the activity touched a system we control. If he copied the files to a private device, we will need to follow the proper forensic process." "Then do not speculate," Maya said. "Preserve what we have." I changed lanes and reduced my speed. The rain had thickened, smearing the red taillights ahead into long, distorted lines. "Grant knew I would receive an alert," I said. "He either stopped caring, or he believed I would be too distracted by the affair to notice." Lena released a quiet breath. "He has always believed personal conflict makes people careless." That was true. Grant considered emotion a weakness in everyone except himself. When a client became angry, he called them irrational. When an employee questioned him, he described them as insecure. When I challenged one of his projections, he accused me of being afraid to grow. He could turn any objection into evidence that the other person was unstable. Tonight, he expected me to become the furious wife. He wanted screaming, threats, and impulsive decisions he could later describe as retaliation. I glanced at my wedding ring resting against the steering wheel. For 6 years, I had worn it through contract negotiations, delayed flights, construction emergencies, and countless dinners where Grant accepted praise for work he had never completed. My mistake had not been trusting him once. My mistake had been continuing to protect the illusion after I saw how much he enjoyed it. My phone vibrated in the center console. A message from Paige appeared across the dashboard display. "Please do not punish Grant at work because our relationship changed." A second message arrived before I could dismiss the first. "Mom says you need time to calm down. We can discuss the house and company tomorrow." The house and company. Paige had been publicly attached to Grant for less than an hour, and she was already speaking as though my assets had become subjects for family negotiation. I took a screenshot of both messages and forwarded them to Maya. "Do not reply," Maya instructed. "Not tonight." I was not planning to. That answer surprised me with its honesty. In the past, I would have called Paige immediately. I would have explained the deed, the corporate structure, the prenuptial agreement, and every other fact she had been too arrogant to ask about. I would have tried to force her to understand before she hurt herself. But Paige had not come to me confused. She had come to dinner prepared to humiliate me. Whatever Grant had promised her, she had chosen to believe it, because the fantasy allowed her to stand over me for once. I would not reward that choice by becoming her unpaid financial advisor. "Noah," I said, "preserve Grant's activity exactly as it exists. Do not open personal folders, do not search private accounts, and do not attempt to follow him outside Northline's systems. Understood? Lena, review every reimbursement, vendor payment, and business development expense he approved within his authorization threshold. Do not contact any outside party until Maya clears it. I will start with the last 6 months. Go back 12. A pause followed. "Dana," Lena said carefully, "that is going to take time." "I know. It would also cost money. A serious internal review could delay projects, consume reserves, and frighten clients who had no patience for uncertainty. The responsible choice was not the comfortable one. It rarely was." Another call flashed across the dashboard. "Mom." I declined it. She called again immediately. Then Grant's name appeared. I let that call ring until the screen went dark. My refusal to answer was not a game. I knew Grant well enough to understand what he wanted. He wanted to hear pain in my voice. He wanted confirmation that the affair had shattered my judgment. Most of all, he wanted to control the first conversation before I understood what he had taken. He would not get that advantage. Noah returned to the call after several minutes. "I have preserved the access records and created a protected snapshot of the export event. There is one more detail." "What is it?" The download was not random. He moved through the folders in a specific order. He opened the ownership materials first, then the investor projections, then the certification template. Maya's voice became quieter. "That sounds prepared." "It was," I said. The betrayal at the dinner table had been loud and theatrical. This was different. This had structure. Grant had not simply fallen in love with my sister and made a reckless decision. He had planned something. The entrance to my neighborhood appeared ahead. I turned beneath the stone archway as the rain tapped harder against the roof. Behind me, Lena, Maya, and Noah continued discussing preservation notices and access protocols. Ahead of me, the garage door began to rise. By then, I understood that my marriage was no longer the most urgent thing Grant had placed at risk. Noah's words hung heavily in the quiet space of my car. I parked in my garage, killed the engine, and carried my laptop straight into my home office. Rain lashed against the window panes, creating a steady drumming sound that usually helped me think. Tonight, it just felt like a timer counting down. Opening my laptop, I brought the video conference onto the main monitor. Maya sat in her wood-paneled study, her expression carefully neutral, while Lena typed furiously in the glow of her own screen. Noah occupied the third box, a dark silhouette against his server racks. "Do not touch his personal accounts," Maya warned immediately, anticipating my next move. The corporate attorney leaned closer to her camera. "Do not guess his passwords. Do not log into his personal email, and do not confront him about the data. We need to maintain a perfect chain of custody. Everything has to be completely legal." I nodded, dropping my keys onto the desk. "Noah, initiate the administrative lock. Create a read-only copy of his entire Northline workspace and run a comprehensive access report for the last 12 months. The systems administrator confirmed the legal hold and vanished from the call to execute the commands. Leaving the video bridge open, I walked across the room to the wall, safe hidden behind a framed architectural print. The cold metal dial clicked under my fingers. Inside sat a thick, fireproof envelope containing the foundation of my entire life. Spreading the documents across my mahogany desk, I ran my hands over the heavy paper. The original Articles of Organization for Northline Design Group. The capitalization table showing 100% ownership under my name. The deed to the house I was currently standing in. and the prenuptial agreement Grant had signed 6 years ago. He had laughed on the day we signed that document. He called the paperwork a romance killer, sliding the folder across the lawyer's table with a dismissive wave of his hand. Grant believed that because the marriage felt safe, the legalities did not matter. He had spent years operating under the assumption that proximity to wealth was the exact same thing as possessing it. Dana. Lena's voice broke through my thoughts. My chief financial officer was staring at me through the monitor, her brow furrowed. We need to talk about the optics. You let him build an image that we are now going to have to tear down. My jaw tightened. I started to defend myself, but the words died in my throat. Lena was right. For years, I had stood beside Grant at industry galas and client dinners, while he casually referred to Northline as our company. I never corrected him in public. It had simply been easier to let him charm the investors while I handled the actual operations. I would quietly fix his official title in the internal directories the next morning, assuming that was enough. He is my husband and an executive, I said finally, the admission tasting bitter. I thought the paper trail would always speak louder than a cocktail party introduction. The ambiguity became a risk, Lena replied gently. And now he is downloading investor packages. We have to suspend him. I pulled a blank corporate letterhead from my drawer. Based on the irregular access logs and the severe data security risk, I drafted a formal notice of administrative leave with pay. This was standard procedure pending an internal investigation. I was not firing him for sleeping with my sister. I was removing him from the network for jeopardizing my company. Noah severed Grant's access at exactly midnight. 3 minutes later, my cell phone rang. Grant's name illuminated the screen. I answered on the second ring, putting the call on speaker so Maya and Lena could hear. You disabled my login, Grant said. His voice lacked the smooth, persuasive tone he usually deployed. He sounded breathless, angry, and entirely confident. You are using the IT department to throw a marital tantrum, Dana. Turn it back on. You are on paid administrative leave pending a security review, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. All communication regarding your employment must go through the Human Resources Director and our legal counsel. When you calm down, Paige and I will come by our house to gather my things, he countered, attempting to steer the conversation back to his familiar territory of emotional manipulation. I looked down at the documents spread across my desk. It is not your house. The silver car you drove tonight belongs to the company fleet, and Northline belongs entirely to me. You are an employee. That is what the paperwork says. You weigh. You weigh? That is what the paperwork says, Grant replied, letting out a sharp, condescending laugh. It is not what people believe. The market knows who really built that business. He ended the call before I could respond. The dial tone echoed in my quiet office, followed by a heavy silence from the video conference. Maya began typing a note about his threat, but Lena suddenly gasped. Dana, the CFO said, her eyes wide as she scrolled through a spreadsheet on her end. I just found a vendor reimbursement request Grant submitted last week. The amount was small enough to bypass your direct approval, categorized under business development. Who is the vendor? I asked, pulling up the financial portal on my own screen. A company called Mercer Growth Partners, Lena answered, reading the state registry data she had just pulled. They incorporated 4 months ago. My hands went completely still on the keyboard. 4 months ago. Long before the dinner. Long before the public betrayal. I opened the public filing record for the new entity, scanning down to the ownership section. The registered manager and majority member was not Grant. The name printed on the legal filing was Paige Lawson. My sister was not just a sudden mistake or a spontaneous affair. Her name had been sitting on a corporate entity tied to my husband since July. She had been integrated into his financial structure while coming over for Sunday dinners and borrowing my clothes. Before I could process the depth of that specific betrayal, Lena sent a file directly to my inbox. Open the original reimbursement receipt, Lena instructed, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Look at the memo line Grant typed at the bottom. I clicked the document. At the very bottom of the expense form, typed in small, unassuming letters, sat a justification for the transfer. It read, Northline Acquisition Preparation. Tuesday morning brought a different kind of exposure to the Northline executive suite. The smell of fresh espresso usually signaled the start of a productive day, but Lena bypassed the break room entirely. My chief financial officer walked into my office, ignored the leather guest chairs, and slid her phone across my glass desk. A social media post filled the bright screen. My sister smiled radiantly next to Grant in a completely unfurnished apartment. The caption read simply, "New beginnings." Through the window behind them, the Silver Company SUV sat parked in the damp asphalt lot. Resting on the kitchen counter in the foreground was a thick leather binder embossed with the Mercer Growth Partners logo. A major architectural client had taken a screenshot of the public post and forwarded the image to our corporate inbox. The accompanying message asked if our vice president of business development had departed to launch a rival firm. My jaw tightened as I studied the digital image. Grant looked relaxed, displaying the confident posture of a triumphant entrepreneur. Paige leaned heavily into his shoulder, completely unaware that the luxury vehicle outside belonged to my corporate fleet and could be repossessed at any moment. I handed the device back to Lena, instructing her to draft a neutral holding statement for the client. We would not engage publicly until the security logs were complete. My desk phone rang exactly 2 hours later. The caller ID displayed Colin Reeves, a private equity investor we had courted for a minor commercial expansion project the previous year. Colin bypassed a polite greeting. His voice sounded tight, clipped with intense irritation, and layered with the background noise of a busy airport terminal. He demanded to know why Grant was 3 weeks late delivering the final ownership certificates. Grant assured me the bridge loan would secure his 40% equity purchase, Colin stated loudly, speaking over a boarding announcement. "We need the finalized Northline transition papers today, Dana. I am not wiring another cent without them." My fingers clamped hard around the receiver. 40% equity. A bridge loan. The words formed a dangerous new puzzle on my desk, linking the late-night server downloads to the shell company my sister owned. I did not accuse Colin of being foolish, and I did not scream about my impending divorce proceedings. Taking a slow breath, I simply asked the investor to forward every single document my husband had provided to his firm over the last 3 months. The email arrived moments later with a massive encrypted attachment. A sleek investor deck opened on my main monitor. The presentation utilized high-resolution photographs from my own real estate staging portfolio, and the revenue projections matched the exact numbers Grant had downloaded on Sunday night. The founder biography, however, featured a smiling portrait of Grant Mercer. One particular slide detailed a family-controlled transition, utilizing the exact phrases from a keynote speech I had delivered in Chicago 3 years ago. Scrolling past the fraudulent deck, I opened the financial annex. A scanned personal guarantee stared back at me. The signature at the bottom belonged to Paige Lawson. The notary date stamped next to her messy cursive was the 14th of August, 2 full months before she walked into our mother's dining room and announced she was wildly in love. A cold, uncomfortable pressure settled behind my ribs. Grant had not chosen my sister in a sudden moment of passion or marital dissatisfaction. He had recruited a clean credit score while we were still picking out anniversary presents. He had groomed Paige to secure a loan he could never qualify for on his own. My cell phone lit up on the desk pad. Barbara. Mom did not waste time with pleasantries when I answered. "You are trying to destroy their new business," she said, her voice echoing slightly on the speakerphone. "Paige told me you suspended him out of pure spite." I kept my eyes fixed on the August date glowing on the monitor. "Do you have any idea how much money Paige just personally guaranteed for a man with a failed startup history?" Grant said the signatures were just a formality. Mom let out an exasperated sigh, the sound carrying decades of practiced dismissal. "You have always been jealous of how easily people like her, Dana. Do not take it out on their company. Do not remove any paperwork from this house, and do not send Grant anything from my office," I replied, ending the call before she could formulate another defense. Lena watched me place the phone face down. The CFO crossed her arms, waiting for my next directive. "I thought his obsession with titles was just ego," I admitted to the empty air between us. "A bruised ego I could manage by letting him talk at dinners." "Intelligence does not make you immune to a con, Dana," Lena said quietly. "We need an independent forensic auditor," We need to trace exactly where Colin's money went. I agreed immediately, knowing the massive hourly rates would force us to pause our regional expansion plans entirely. The truth cost money, and I was willing to pay it to protect the foundation I had built. A new notification chimed from my inbox. Colin had sent a follow-up email containing a brief audio file pulled from his corporate voicemail system. I clicked play, letting the sound fill the quiet office. Grant's voice echoed through the speakers, smooth and heavily practiced. Do not worry about the delays, Colin. Paige's credit is the only clean thing left. Once Dana pays me out, none of this will matter. The cold autumn rain continued to pour behind Paige as she stood on my front porch. That grating vibration from her phone finally stopped, leaving a heavy, exhausted silence in its wake. 2 weeks had passed since the Sunday dinner, bringing us back to this miserable night on the 26th of October. Stepping back, I allowed my younger sister to cross the threshold. Water dripped from her thin jacket onto the hardwood floor. In the past, whenever Paige manufactured a crisis, I would immediately brew chamomile tea and start pulling fresh linens for the guest bedroom. Tonight, I walked into the kitchen and returned with a bare wooden tray. Setting it down on the entry console, I tapped the flat surface twice. Put your phone, your laptop, and every single collection letter you brought right there, I instructed. Paige wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the tray as if it were a trap. You are interrogating me. You are asking for my help, I corrected, keeping my voice completely neutral. If you do not want to be transparent, the door is still open behind you. Tears welled in her eyes, but she reached into her oversized tote bag. A damp stack of envelopes hit the wood, followed by a silver laptop and the cracked cell phone. The documents bore the letterheads of aggressive corporate recovery agencies. He left 2 days ago, Paige confessed, her voice barely a whisper. She stared at the floor. He said he needed to meet with investors in another city to finalize the transition. Then the apartment management called. The lease is entirely in the name of Mercer Growth Partners, and the first month was paid using a commercial bridge loan. When the loan went into default, they towed the SUV straight out of the parking lot. Northline had legally repossessed the vehicle because Grant was on administrative suspension, but I did not bother explaining corporate fleet policies. I picked up the top collection letter. You signed 2 personal guarantees and a business line of credit, I noted, scanning the fine print. He told me they were just formalities, Paige pleaded, stepping closer. Grant promised they would not even activate until Northline officially transferred the equity shares to his new firm. The first payment was apparently late before that family dinner. The mechanics of the fraud clicked into place perfectly. Grant had listed his own phone number and email as the primary contact on the loan application, keeping all the initial warnings completely hidden. Paige simply existed in the file as the guarantor. When my husband stopped answering and blocked the collection agencies, the lenders moved down the contact list, flooding her personal inbox and mailing address. When exactly did you start sleeping with him? I asked, setting the letter down. Her posture defensive, my sister immediately crossed her arms. Dana, your marriage was completely dead long before I ever stepped into the picture. You never even looked at him when he talked. I asked you for a date, Paige, not an excuse. She swallowed hard, the defiance melting away under my stare. Late July. We met for drinks after he pitched a client. Late July. She had become his lover weeks before signing the financial guarantees in August. He had secured her loyalty, ensuring she would sign whatever documents he placed in front of her without question. Can I stay here tonight? She asked, glancing toward the hallway that led to the guest suites. Just until I figure out a plan. My hands curled slightly against the edge of the console table. This woman had actively brought my husband into this very house while I was traveling for business, or she had used her family access to wander through my home office. No, I told her, my voice remarkably steady. I will call an independent attorney to represent you tomorrow morning. You will pay his retainer yourself, and you will answer for whatever legal obligations you signed your name to. I will help stop Grant. That is not the same as rescuing you. Paige looked as though I had slapped her. A fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks, yet she slowly picked up her phone from the tray. Unlocking the screen, she opened her text messages and turned the device toward me. I agreed to let a lawyer supervise the data, she said, her voice shaking. But you need to see this now. Grant told me to delete a specific thread called ownership drafts yesterday. I kept it. She had preserved the evidence not out of suspicion, but because she wanted to hold on to his romantic promises. Scrolling past his demanding texts, my eyes caught a new notification at the top of her inbox. It was an unread email from Grant, sent only minutes ago. I pointed to the bold text. Open that. Paige tapped the screen. The message loaded instantly, revealing a subject line that made the temperature in the room feel significantly colder. It read, "If Dana fights, this is the story we tell." I took the phone from Paige, staring at the glowing screen. The subject line stared back at me, a blatant declaration of war. Below it sat a carefully typed draft statement, intended for public release if I ever took the fraud to court. Grant had written a complete revision of reality. The document claimed Mercer Growth Partners belonged entirely to my sister and stated that I had willingly provided the financial projections to help her secure capital. The man I married described himself merely as a supportive husband who facilitated introductions. Grant was not planning to leave me for her. My husband intended to pit us against each other, turning his wife and his mistress into co-conspirators while he played the innocent middleman. 2 digital files were attached to the bottom of the email. The first document contained the investment contract Colin had signed, which clearly listed Grant as the incoming equity owner. The second attachment told a completely different story. Labeled as a legal defense strategy, this version listed Paige as the sole proprietor of the shell company. More dangerously, it included a signed confirmation letter authorizing the use of Northline corporate data. A signature rested on the bottom line. The dark ink curved in the precise way I signed thousands of company checks. My hands suddenly felt very cold. Grant had forged my name. My teeth ground together so hard my jaw ached. The urge to forward the entire thread to every single client in Charlotte nearly overwhelmed me. Reaching for my own phone, I dialed Maya and read the draft statement aloud. Our corporate attorney stopped me before the sentence even finished. "You cannot blast this out, Dana," Maya warned, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of my office. Uncontrolled disclosure could permanently damage the investor relationships and compromise the chain of custody. We have to freeze his assets through the courts, and that means following procedure. Frustration burned in my throat, mainly because she was absolutely right. For the first time in my professional life, decisive action was not the immediate answer. A specific memory washed over me then. 3 years ago, at a massive charity gala, Grant had stood at a podium and introduced himself as the co-founder of Northline. The crowd applauded, and his charismatic speech directly secured a lucrative commercial contract. Sitting at the head table, I had chosen not to correct him. The financial benefits of his false image had served me perfectly well, right up until the moment that same illusion was weaponized against me. Paige leaned over the console table in the hallway, reading the draft over my shoulder. Her breath hitched in her throat. The reality of the typed words finally shattered the romantic fantasy she had desperately clung to, because the statement shifted the entirety of the legal liability directly onto her shoulders. "He's just panicking," my sister whispered, though her hands shook violently. "He cannot possibly mean to blame me." "Intelligence does not allow you to decide what you want to believe," I told her, pointing at the glowing screen. "The evidence is sitting right in front of you." Leaving Paige standing in the entryway, I returned to my computer and unmuted the conference line. Authorizing a comprehensive forensic audit meant accepting that the massive expense would effectively kill our regional expansion project for the year. Taking a deep breath, I handed direct reporting authority over to Lena. Removing my own absolute control ensured the auditors could work without any accusations of internal interference. It was a terrifying step, but a necessary one. Late night rain continued to beat against the windows while the security team cataloged the newly surrendered devices. At 2 a.m, my cell phone vibrated with an urgent text from Noah. The systems administrator had recovered a deleted message Grant had sent to a private offshore broker exactly 1 day before the Sunday dinner. Opening the secure viewer, I read a single sentence that cemented the true timeline. "After the last transfer clears, let the sisters sort it out. because I will be gone before either one understands the exposure. Early November arrived with gray skies and a biting wind that rattled the bare oak branches outside my mother's colonial home. Barbara had set out a spread of warm lemon bread and spiced tea on her mahogany dining table, attempting to recreate the cozy atmosphere of a traditional family gathering as if nothing had shattered. I did not sit down. Standing beside the heavy velvet drapes, I looked at the woman who had spent decades teaching me that my only value lay in keeping the peace. "Tell me what you gave him, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Barbara paused, a silver knife hovering over the cake. Her lips tightened into a defensive line, and her eyes flickered toward Paige, who sat rigidly near the corner of the room. "I only sent a few photographs of old office reports," Barbara muttered, her fingers trembling slightly against the handle of the knife. "Grant was terribly worried you were going to hide assets during the separation. A husband has a right to know what belongs to his household, Dana. He never owned a single square inch of that company," I replied, stepping closer to the table. "You handed over documents that allowed him to steal from investors." My mother reached for her phone, tapping the screen with a manicured nail to display a series of archived messages. A photograph appeared on the display, showing a corner of my private home office, taken while I was out of state on a business trip. Resting on the desk was a yellow sticky note containing a confidential project code and an investor email address. Another text from Grant showed him instructing her precisely to capture the page detailing revenue and ownership language. Beneath those instructions sat a message Barbara had sent back to him. "Dana always cleans up after Paige," the text read clearly. "She will pay whatever it takes before she lets the family name go through a public courtroom." The words felt like a physical blow, landing squarely behind my ribs. The betrayal ran far deeper than a cheating husband or a desperate sister. Grant had engineered his entire strategy around a toxic family dynamic that had governed my life since childhood. Barbara created the crises, Paige played the victim, and I was always expected to pay the financial and emotional price in absolute silence. Paige stared at her mother, her face draining of all color. "You knew he was digging into her files, and you helped him?" "He told me it was just a formality to protect your future," Barbara insisted, her voice rising in panic. "Your sister deserves happiness, Dana. You have always been too cold, too guarded. You have enough money to fix this quietly." "I am not paying a single cent of the debts Paige chose to sign," I stated, turning my back on the table. "You can hire your own attorney if you are terrified of the liability, but I am done cleaning up this family's wreckage." Walking out the front door, I climbed into my car and started the engine. The heater blew warm air against my face, but the cold weight in my chest remained. My cell phone rang before I even pulled out of the driveway. Lena was on the line, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Dana, you need to look at your email right now," the chief financial officer said without any greeting. "Grant just submitted an emergency electronic wire request to the escrow agent to release the final $480,000 into an overseas account on Monday morning." The weekend stretched ahead like a narrow corridor with no exit. From Friday evening through Monday morning, my legal team operated under immense pressure while I reviewed every piece of documentation we could gather. Maya spent hours compiling our emergency petition, verifying each exhibit while Evelyn warned me strictly against mixing personal family grievances with corporate fraud. We could not call the escrow agent ourselves to issue a casual command. Every step had to follow strict legal protocol to avoid any claim of unlawful interference. Financial records confirmed that the $480,000 would release automatically once the escrow holder received the final owner consent verification, a DocuSign audit certificate, and a confirmation email from Northline. Grant had submitted an electronic packet displaying my name and digital signature image. Yet our forensic review exposed the trap. The audit certificate proved the document was routed through a lookalike domain with a web address nearly identical to our corporate server, while the device, internet protocol address, and hardware signature belonged directly to Grant. Colin Reeves confirmed he had never spoken directly with me to verify the authorization. A heavy knock on my home office door interrupted my review on Sunday afternoon. Paige stood in the doorway, clutching a sealed manila envelope. My sister dropped the envelope onto the corner of my desk. Grant sent this courier package to my apartment 10 minutes ago. He wants me to sign an affidavit before Monday morning, or he claims he will ensure every single debt lands entirely on my shoulders. I pulled the papers from the folder. The printed text demanded my sister swear under oath that she acted as the primary director of Mercer Growth Partners with my full awareness and consent. If I sign this, he says he will make the debt disappear, Paige whispered, her hands trembling as she looked down at the floor. And if you sign it, you may disappear under it with him, I replied, my voice chilling the air between us. Silence hung heavy in the room. Paige stared at the blank signature line for a long, agonizing moment before dropping her pen onto the wood. She refused to pick it up, yet she still had not told me her final decision. Maya called just as the sun dipped below the horizon, her tone urgent and sharp. We have everything ready for the judge's signature. The emergency petition includes your sworn affidavit, the forged DocuSign audit trail, the look-alike domain headers, and the flight itinerary indicating he intends to leave the jurisdiction. We file at first light. Monday morning arrived with a pale, watery sunlight that offered no warmth to the frosted grass outside my office windows. At 8 o'clock, Paige sat across from my corporate attorney in a small conference room downtown, reading through an independent statement while her own lawyer reviewed every clause. My sister did not look at her phone once during the entire hour. When she finally picked up a pen, she signed a comprehensive declaration detailing how Grant had systematically deceived her about the nature of the business and the guarantees. She also surrendered her personal laptop and phone to the technical forensic team, ensuring every chat log and email remained fully accessible for the court record. Opening her digital inbox on a secondary screen, Maya pulled up a final correspondence that my sister had previously overlooked. An email thread stamped from the previous month revealed a direct message sent by my husband to an overseas broker. The text instructed the recipient to handle the final wire transfer with absolute discretion. After the last transfer, let the sisters sort it out, the message read coldly. I will be out before either one understands the exposure. Another saved note in the draft folder labeled my sister simply as the guarantor, confirming that her role in his life carried a strict expiration date tied directly to the closing of the escrow account. Paige stared at the words on the screen for a long, silent moment. The romantic illusion fractured completely, leaving behind the stark reality that she had never been cherished or protected. She had merely served as a convenient credit score to fund a betrayal. Just after 9 o'clock, my cell phone chimed with an incoming call from Grant. I answered on speakerphone, keeping my voice entirely neutral while Maya recorded the exchange for legal documentation. Grant sounded smooth at first, slipping effortlessly into the comforting cadence he used when trying to soothe an upset client. He asked why I was making everything so difficult, claiming we could settle our personal matters privately if I just let the escrow transaction close without interference. When I remained silent, the pleasant facade dissolved instantly into a harsh snarl. He warned me that my stubbornness would destroy Northline forever, boasting that our mother would gladly testify on his behalf to prove I was a vindictive spouse trying to ruin him. When he demanded to know where Paige was hiding, my sister leaned toward the receiver and spoke directly into the microphone. "Where are you right now?" Paige asked, her voice steady and cold. Grant paused for a fraction of a second, attempting to recover his composure before spinning another excuse about attending an urgent meeting with international investors. Yet the background audio leaking through his connection told a completely different story. The sharp announcements of a regional airport terminal echoed softly behind his voice, accompanied by the distinct hum of automated sliding doors and rolling luggage wheels. He was already at the transit hub, rushing to catch his one-way flight before the legal system locked his accounts. Paige did not engage in a shouting match or beg for explanations. Following precise instructions from her legal counsel, she disconnected the call and preserved the recent call log as formal evidence. By 10 o'clock, Maya presented our emergency motion before the civil court judge. The evidentiary packet left no room for debate, featuring the forged DocuSign audit certificate, the look-alike domain routing headers, the flight itinerary, and Paige's sworn statement detailing the pressure to sign the fraudulent affidavit. The presiding judge reviewed the exhibits and promptly issued a temporary restraining order specifically targeting the disputed escrow funds and the fraudulent corporate filings, while explicitly declining to freeze unrelated personal assets prematurely. The notification reached the escrow agent exactly 20 minutes before the $480,000 wire transfer was scheduled to execute. Colin Reeves received an official corporate notice from my office explaining that the proposed equity purchase was tied to unauthorized transactions and fraudulent documentation, protecting the investor's funds from disappearing into an offshore account. Grant contacted the escrow office, expecting confirmation that the final release had been authorized, only to be informed by the corporate officer that the transaction was legally frozen under a court order. Within minutes, my phone rang again. Grant was frantic, screaming through the speaker that my sister had completely ruined everything by refusing to cooperate. "No," I told him, looking out the glass window of my office at the quiet street below. "She finally understood you." He slammed the line dead, leaving a hollow tone humming in my ear. Paige stood near my desk, her hands resting nervously on the back of a guest chair. She looked small, stripped of the designer clothes and arrogant posture she had worn during the past few months. "I suppose you want me to thank you now," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the hardwood floor. "My actions today were necessary to protect the company and stop the fraud," I replied, keeping a deliberate distance between us. "That does not erase what you did. It does not erase the fact that you walked into my life, slept with my husband, and signed papers because you thought you could take everything I built." Paige swallowed hard, a tear finally spilling down her cheek. "Can we ever go back to the way things were before all of this happened?" "Before was part of the problem," I told her quietly. "You need to leave now and let your attorney handle the rest of your obligations." She nodded once, grabbed her bag, and walked out of the office without another word. Silence settled over my workspace, heavy and profound. The immediate crisis was contained, but the screen on my desk soon lit up with a final, desperate threat sent directly from Grant's mobile number. "You stopped the transfer," the message read in bold capital letters. "You did not stop me from telling everyone you built the fraud." Attached to the text was a calendar invitation for an emergency morning meeting scheduled with our largest commercial clients and primary investors, designed to drag my professional reputation into the mud before the legal authorities could even begin their formal investigation. The morning sun filtered through the vertical blinds of our primary conference room, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished mahogany table. Outside the glass walls, staff members moved with tense, hurried steps, whispering behind cupped hands. Maya sat quietly to my left, her leather portfolio zipped shut, while Lena adjusted her glasses and tapped the corner of her tablet. We had spent the previous evening organizing every piece of undeniable proof we possessed, preparing for an assault that could either protect Northline Design Group or tear it apart entirely. Grant appeared on the wall-mounted display screen exactly 5 minutes before the scheduled time. He sat in a high-backed leather chair in an undisclosed location, flanked by a high-priced corporate attorney who looked entirely unimpressed with the proceedings. Several key commercial clients and 2 private equity investors joined the video conference seconds later, their faces etched with deep confusion and mounting anxiety. My husband did not wait for a formal introduction. He leaned forward, flashing the charismatic, disarming smile that had once convinced me he was a visionary leader rather than a polished grifter. "Dana has called this emergency session because our marriage has broken down," Grant announced to the room, pitching his voice to sound wounded yet reasonable. "She is attempting to weaponize company resources and fabricate compliance issues simply because I chose to leave our personal relationship. I built the growth of this firm alongside her, and now she is locking me out to protect her ego." Murmurs rippled through the virtual attendees. One of our oldest commercial partners shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking straight into the camera lens. "Is it true that you are locked out of company accounts?" the client asked, his tone heavy with suspicion. I kept my hands resting flat on the table, refusing to let his performance rattle my composure. Lena stepped in before I could speak, sliding a pristine digital deck onto the main display. "The documents on your screen outline the founding structure of Northline Design Group," Lena stated clearly, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "Dana Mercer incorporated this entity 3 years prior to her marriage, holding 100% of the equity. Mr. Mercer was employed under a standard executive contract, specifying a base salary and performance bonuses, with 0 equity allocation or ownership rights." Grant's pleasant expression vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, dangerous scowl. He interrupted his own lawyer with an aggressive wave of his hand. She let me introduce myself as co-founder at every major public event for years, Grant shouted, leaning so close to his webcam that his face filled the frame. She encouraged the illusion because it helped close contracts. She knew about every single presentation and every single pitch. Silence descended upon the conference room. I looked directly at the screen, letting the truth hang heavily in the air. "He is entirely correct about one thing," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. "I permitted him to use that title in public because his charismatic presence benefited our corporate sales. That was a serious administrative failure on my part, and I take full responsibility for my poor oversight." Maya glanced sideways at me with a sharp expression of caution, knowing I had just handed opposing counsel a public admission. Yet I did not stop there. "That oversight did not create ownership shares," I continued, looking around the room at our investors. "It did not grant authorization to forge my digital signature. It did not permit the creation of a lookalike domain to bypass escrow controls. And it certainly did not give anyone the right to siphon investor capital into a private shell company." Paige opened the heavy oak door of the conference room and stepped inside. She wore a simple charcoal blazer, completely devoid of the expensive jewelry she usually flaunted. Without speaking a word, she walked to the end of the table and placed her personal smartphone directly beside my laptop. Maya handed the device to our technical specialist, who mirrored the screen onto the display monitors. A series of chat logs and recorded voice memos began to play through the room's speakers. "He told me the personal guarantees were just legal formalities," Paige stated, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed the assembled investors. She did not look at Grant on the screen. "He told me the shell company was designed to help us transition smoothly, and he made me sign a fraudulent affidavit yesterday morning, under the explicit threat that he would leave me to shoulder every single cent of the debt alone." Grant stared at my sister through the monitor, his eyes wide with absolute fury. "You ungrateful little fool," he hissed, forgetting he was broadcasting to his own victims. "You were supposed to back me up. Did you ever choose me?" Paige asked softly, looking straight into the camera lens. "Or did you only ever want my credit score?" The corporate attorney sitting beside Grant on the video feed leaned over, whispered something urgently into his client's ear, and frantically clicked his laptop shut. The video connection abruptly flickered and died, leaving a blank black rectangle where my husband's face had just been. Colin Reeves cleared his throat, breaking the heavy stillness that filled the room. The investor looked down at the forensic financial report Lena had provided. "We need to review the audit findings in full detail with our own legal counsel," Colin said, though his tone had shifted from aggressive hostility to cautious relief. "But it is entirely clear that Mercer Growth Partners had no legal authority to bind Northline." Following the meeting, I consulted outside counsel and reviewed the completed internal investigation. I then formally terminated Grant's employment for gross misconduct and fraudulent activity. The fallout hit us immediately. One of our regional clients paused their ongoing contract pending the outcome of the forensic audit, while Northline had to draw upon corporate reserve funds to cover the exorbitant expenses of the independent financial investigation. I stood before our remaining staff members that afternoon, explaining the reality of the situation without hiding behind corporate jargon, ensuring everyone understood that no employee was expected to carry the burden of my personal mistakes. Late that evening, after the office had emptied out and the cleaning crew finished their rounds, my cell phone chimed on the quiet desk. Maya forwarded a message she had just received from Grant's defense attorney. The opposing counsel was officially proposing a settlement agreement. My husband was willing to renounce all practical claims to the company, the house, and the vehicles. And he offered to return a portion of the remaining funds, provided I agreed to publicly characterize the entire ordeal as a simple business misunderstanding and ceased cooperating with law enforcement and any regulatory investigation. I looked at the proposal, knowing that signing it would instantly restore our short-term public image and stop the bleeding of our client accounts. Yet it would allow a man who forged signatures and manipulated my family to walk away without a criminal record, leaving our investors to absorb the financial losses. Closing the laptop screen, I left the document unsigned, knowing the hardest choices were still ahead of us. The settlement proposal sat on my desk like a piece of poison disguised as a gift. Evelyn reviewed the legal terms alongside me, confirming that Grant was offering to walk away from any practical claims regarding the company, the house, and the vehicles, while returning a fraction of the diverted funds. In exchange, he demanded that I publicly label the entire criminal enterprise as a regrettable business misunderstanding. I looked at my divorce attorney and shook my head. "We reject the settlement," I told her, my voice completely steady. "I will not buy peace with someone else's loss." Over the following months, the forensic audit mapped out the full extent of the damage. The investigation stretched through the winter and deep into the spring, uncovering every falsified bank trail, look-alike domain, routing header, and fraudulent wire transfer. Grant was formally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft. Rather than facing a prolonged trial after the forensic records and witness statements left his defense with very little room to maneuver, he ultimately accepted a plea agreement during the early weeks of June. The sentencing hearing took place on a bright, stifling afternoon in downtown Charlotte. I stood before the judicial bench to deliver my victim impact statement, looking directly at the federal judge while speaking clearly about the human cost of corporate deception. I detailed how my employees had suffered under the cloud of suspicion, how our investors had been manipulated through forged documentation, and how personal relationships had been systematically weaponized as financial instruments. When the proceedings concluded, a federal marshal escorted Grant past the gallery in handcuffs. He turned his head, catching my eye for a fraction of a second, wearing an expression that practically begged for a crumb of pity or mercy. I did not smile, and I did not look away. Remembering the exact words I wanted him to carry into federal prison, I spoke quietly across the aisle. "You said you deserved everything you built," I told him, letting every syllable land with absolute weight. "Now you have to live with what you actually built." He was led away through the heavy wooden doors, leaving behind a profound stillness. My sister faced a separate reckoning for her choices. Paige cooperated fully with the federal investigators, ensuring a clear distinction was established between the accounts where her signature had been forged or manipulated and the business line of credit she had willingly entered into. Despite her cooperation, the consequences were devastating. She lost her small digital media agency, sold her luxury wardrobe to cover immediate legal expenses, and moved into a modest studio apartment on the far side of town. She took a stable administrative job at a regional logistics firm, dedicating every extra paycheck toward the debt she had foolishly guaranteed. One Sunday afternoon in late summer, my phone rang with an unfamiliar local number. When I answered, Paige's voice came through the speaker, hesitant and stripped of its former arrogance. She asked if we could eventually rebuild a relationship, slowly and from a distance. "We can build something new, Paige," I replied, standing by my kitchen window and looking out over the manicured lawn, "but we cannot go back to how things were before, and today is not the day to start." She accepted my boundary without argument, whispering a quiet goodbye before ending the call. Our mother suffered a different kind of isolation. Barbara was never charged criminally, since the forensic evidence proved she had no comprehension of the underlying financial fraud. Yet neither Paige nor I allowed her to resume her role as the family matriarch and manipulator. When Barbara attempted to corner me during a brief grocery store encounter, suggesting that I should feel grateful toward Paige for finally doing the right thing in the end, I stopped her with a single sentence. "One correct choice does not erase a dozen calculated betrayals," I told her, walking past her cart without looking back. Northline Design Group survived the winter, though the company emerged smaller and leaner than before. We lost one major commercial development contract during the height of the investigation, and corporate reserves were heavily depleted by the sheer cost of the forensic audit. Yet the structural integrity of the firm was completely intact. I instituted a rigorous corporate governance policy featuring dual approval protocols, strict title verifications, independent financial reviews, and direct reporting lines straight to Lena. I finally stepped out from behind the scenes, taking my rightful place at industry events as the sole founder and chief executive officer. Realizing that our marital home held too many ghosts of a life built on quicksand, I placed the sprawling suburban property on the market and sold it within a month. I moved into a clean, modern townhome closer to the downtown design district, completely shedding the symbols of a marriage defined by hidden manipulation. It was now early December, marking roughly 14 weeks since the absolute divorce decree was officially signed and sealed by the court. Sitting at my new walnut desk, I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a small, velvet-lined storage box. Resting inside was the silver key to the company SUV. The very token Grant had tossed onto my mother's dining room table on the night he thought he had won everything. I placed the metal key inside the box, snapped the brass clasp shut, and slid it into the back of the drawer. My cell phone illuminated on the desk pad, displaying an incoming call from Paige's number. It was Sunday evening, her customary time to check in. I looked at the glowing screen for a long moment, finished signing a set of architectural blueprints, and then set my pen down. For the first time in my life, the choice of whether to answer belonged entirely to me. Never confuse love with leverage, and never mistake the quiet stability of your own hard work for someone else's generosity. When you spend years smoothing over a partner's false claims and absorbing a family's toxic expectations to keep the peace, you are not protecting a relationship. You are building the very trap that will eventually close around you. Real strength does not mean carrying every burden in silence or allowing a polished image to mask a hollow foundation. True security lives in clear boundaries, verifiable facts, and the courage to refuse a comfortable lie. When someone tries to trade your accomplishments for their own ambition, remember that paperwork and truth will always outlast a charming performance. What is the hardest boundary you have ever had to set to protect what you built with your own hands?